Today we're taking a look at an iPhone 5 that should be running iOS 7. And I thought that would be really interesting to check out here, even though it's not the original version for this device, iOS 6. Let's get it opened up now. And here we go. This is the white and silver iPhone 5. It looks like there are a moderate amount of scratches on this screen. But turning the device over, the back panel looks to be in pretty great condition. There is some slight wear along the corners here, and it looks like some dirt that I should be able to clean up. Let's see if this iPhone has any battery power. And it looks like it does. Okay, and we boot into the iOS 7 slide to unlock screen. So let's do that now. And here is the gorgeous iOS 7 home screen. One of the biggest giveaways that this is iOS 7 rather than any newer version is this passbook icon here. The passbook icon for iOS 7 only had 3 colors with the blue, green, and orange here. Starting with iOS 8, the passbook icon had 4 rows, with a red credit card row being added across the top. Let's go into settings so we can see which version of iOS 7 this device is running. Okay, and it looks like we have 7.1.1 here. That was the second to last version of iOS 7, with 7.1.2 being the very last. So this version was released in early 2014. We can also see that we have an AT&T model here, and it is the base model 16GB storage configuration. Okay, well, I've spent a few minutes with this iPhone and I have some updates. I was going to compare this iPhone with another iPhone 5 I have running iOS 8, and I noticed a few differences. When I powered this iOS 8 one on, there was actually a white boot screen to match the white display bezel. So I remembered when I powered on the iOS 7 one that there was actually a black boot screen. So I ran the serial number for this device in an online checker, and it turns out this is the logic board for a black model. So of course, the IMEI number that this logic board reports does not match the one printed on the actual device. So I know that's not a huge deal or anything, but it's just a little bit weird that the seller did not pick up on that discrepancy. And I must admit, it does bug me a little bit because there's a mismatch between the logic board and the actual frame. So yeah, even though this is kind of an imposter iPhone 5 in the wrong color housing, I'm still really grateful to have it here in my collection. And maybe sometime in the future I can swap this logic board into an actual black and slate housing. But anyway, now we'll take a second and talk about the history of the iPhone 5. So this one came out in September of 2012 as the successor to the iPhone 4S. It brought with it an all-new design and a larger screen size for the first time ever in the iPhone lineup. So whereas all previous iPhones had a 3.5-inch display, the display here was 4 inches. Apple was definitely feeling the pressure to increase their display size at the time, mostly due to competition with Android smartphones. And while the half-an-inch increase didn't sound like a lot on paper, it did make a big difference in day-to-day usage. So compared to the 3.5-inch devices, you got an extra row of applications on the home screen. And especially when doing things like having the keyboard up, you just had a lot more usable space. Also, while I have my 4S out here, you can see the design difference between these two. So the 4S was kind of this sandwich design with glass on the front and back and a stainless steel band in the middle. But in a move that kind of feels similar to what Apple did with the iPhone 17 Pro, Apple switched up from the more premium stainless steel material to aluminum on the iPhone 5. That move made this iPhone the thinnest and lightest ever made at the time. It was 18% thinner than the 4S and 20% lighter. It weighed only 112 grams, and alongside the iPhone 5S, these models would go down in history as being the lightest iPhones ever. So that's a really cool legacy left by those models. The iPhone 6 ended up being a little bit thinner than this. I've always loved the two-tone look on the back of these with the glass inserts on the top and bottom. There's also this really impressive detail known as a diamond chamfered edge. And this design brought with it some functional changes, so the headphone jack was now placed on the bottom of the device. And there was now an all-new port with the Lightning connector. This replaced the old-school 30-pin connector that had been present since 2003 on the iPod. As you can see, the Lightning connector was dramatically smaller, and it was also reversible, which was really helpful. Another great useful upgrade for the iPhone 5 was the addition of 4G LTE cellular. And of course there was a new processor, so this was powered by the A6 chip. That was quoted to be 2 times faster in CPU and GPU compared to the A5, and it doubled the included RAM amount from 512 megabytes to a full 1 gigabyte. Those specs decently future-proofed this iPhone. It ended up receiving software support through iOS 10 in 2016. And it really performed well on pretty much every version it supported, which if you don't know was definitely not the case with the iPhone 4S. The camera on the iPhone 5 was still 8 megapixels, but it was now covered with a sapphire lens. There was also now a third microphone here in between the camera and the flash. And the updated image signal processor in the A6 chip allowed for 40% faster capture as well as better low light performance. And in the way of features, there was now a panorama option. So that was cool for taking really wide shots, especially when you were in an outdoor landscape situation. Also, the front-facing camera on this iPhone got a huge upgrade. So it was now a 1.2 megapixel sensor instead of 0.3 megapixels on the 4S. That camera was only VGA quality, so the camera on the iPhone 5 was just a night and day difference. And now turning our attention to the software on this device. So even though iOS 7 is not the original version for this device, it still feels very fitting, and I'll explain why. So the iPhone 5S and 5C are known for being the first versions that shipped with iOS 7. And of course that is true, but what you may not realize is that the iOS 7 beta versions were tested on the iPhone 5. Obviously because the iPhone 5 was the newest model available when that beta came out in summer of 2013. So if you watch any videos here on YouTube of iOS 7 beta versions, they're likely being shown off on the iPhone 5. And there's also quite a few shots of this running iOS 7 from Apple's website and other promotional materials around that time. The iOS 7 beta versions appeared to be pretty quirky, as Apple really hadn't ironed out all of the details for this new design yet. And yeah, in case you weren't aware, iOS 7 was the first version that brought a full visual redesign to iOS. While iOS 6 used the design philosophy of skeuomorphism, where everything has a lot of depth and a sense of realism to it, iOS 7 traded that out for a very flat and modern look with translucent effects. Examples of that really were everywhere. One of my favorite things to look at between these two versions is the compass. So you can see how flat and simple iOS 7's is, while iOS 6 has a wooden look with a real compass on the screen. And the examples of that really could go on forever between these versions. Plus, aside from the visual differences, there were a lot of functional changes for iOS 7. So first off, we had a new multitasking experience where you would get full screen previews of the application windows. That was not at all the case with iOS 6. You would only receive a preview of the app icon, and closing them out required 2 steps. Another area where iOS 7 really improved was the addition of this control center. This gave you things like an integrated flashlight as well as quick access to other basic device controls. iOS 6 only had some really basic controls to the left of your multitasking interface. And there was an effect on the home screen that was known as parallax. I'm noticing that it's not working on this device, so it may have some sort of issue with the gyroscope. But I can show it to you here on a 5S with iOS 7. So as I tilt the device here, you'll see that the icons and wallpapers slightly move. That gives a really cool 3D effect to the operating system. It's also present on the lock screen. And this is a random point, but the clock on iOS 7 actually moved according to the real time. That was not the case with iOS 6, it was just always stuck at 10:15. Also, there were some new sounds for iOS 7. The default ringtone was now known as opening instead of marimba. So here is the difference between those. And the default text tone was now note instead of tritone. And aside from the sound difference between these, I'm also noting how vigorous the vibration motor is on these. We have definitely gotten spoiled to the more subtle taptic engine on newer iPhones. I'll also touch on the different charging sound between these versions. So here's what it sounds like with iOS 7. And here it is with iOS 6. Here in 2025, unfortunately, there isn't a ton of support for iOS 7. You could jailbreak the device to get some more functionality out of it, but on its own, the App Store no longer works. Some of the content will try and load, but it doesn't actually allow you to sign in and download anything. I believe Siri does still work though, so let's check that out. Show me MLB scores. Okay, so Siri doesn't seem to want to work on this device. Let's try it with another one. Okay, well, it's not working with my 5S on iOS 7 either. This may be some sort of temporary issue, or maybe just something is not right with my Wi-Fi. But anyway, we'll now take a look at the default wallpapers for iOS 7. So one category that was new for this version was dynamic. And these had different colors of bokeh dots that would kind of move when you would tilt your device. These were really fun to play around with. I believe this one was used for the iOS 7 beta. But you also had a really cool selection of stills. So a few of these, including the default, were space themed. Many of the others were nature themed, and there were some abstract choices near the bottom. I think this is definitely one of the best wallpaper selections ever. I really like how all of these look. I've always really enjoyed this wooden image. But I'm thinking for this device, I might go with the dynamic wallpaper that was used on iOS 7 beta. So one last thing we will take a look at on this device is my selection of apps and content. I was able to sync these apps to this device without a jailbreak using an old version of iTunes. So just some nostalgic games and different things like that. Who remembers Shazam before this was actually built into Siri? And if you're not familiar with it, this was the application that would detect a song for you just by playing it. Also, I really like taking a look at these older social media apps. Instagram is really nostalgic for me, as well as the old version of Snapchat. They no longer allow you to log in, but I think it's just cool to have the apps on the home screen. Also, the music app is pretty cool with iOS 7 because it includes something that was known as CoverFlow. I believe CoverFlow started on iPods in 2007, and it was present on every iOS version starting with the first iPhone. It was sadly removed with iOS 8.4 in 2015. That version brought the Apple Music streaming service, so I guess for some reason they didn't want you using CoverFlow with that. But it was just a really fun and quick way to browse through a lot of your albums. And once you found one you liked, you could just click the song within. But yeah, that pretty much concludes my look at this iPhone 5 that is still running iOS 7. Even though this is not the device's original version, as I said, I think it's still really cool to take a look at. So be sure to leave me a comment with your thoughts below. I'm especially curious to hear if anyone remembers running the iOS 7 betas on this iPhone. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.